Heir need a man who can plant a seed of an heir, deep and steady the widow, told the shy and lonely cowboy. The stark porch of the Stony Ridge ranch house was a lonely perch in an unforgiving land, a place that reeked of grief, desperation, and bitter resolve. Sarah O'Connell gripped the railing, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. Tears were a luxury. Mourning was a debt she couldn't afford to pay. Her husband's grave was a fresh scar on the hill, but Jedediah Kane's deadline was a festering wound threatening to claim everything. She didn't need a new husband. She didn't need love. She needed an heir, a son, a seed planted deep and steady to anchor her to this earth. Her gaze fell on the solitary figure mending a fence in the distance, Elias Cole. Quiet, honorable, a man haunted by his own ghosts. He possessed a quiet grit, but he was a lonely soul lost in his own world. He was the perfect answer to an impossible prayer, and he had no idea that she was about to make him a proposition that would either save them both or damn them to a hell far worse than loneliness. Her decision settled cold and heavy as a stone in her gut. She descended the steps, her boots kicking up clouds of red dust that clung to the hem of her black dress. The sun was a molten coin slipping behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, and the air grew thin and cool. Each step toward him felt like a betrayal of her late husband, of God, of the woman she was supposed to be. But the woman she was supposed to be was about to lose everything. She stopped as she neared the corral. Elias wasn't working on the fence anymore. He stood with his back to her, murmuring to her husband's old stallion, a beast as proud and broken as the ranch itself. His calloused hand ran down the horse's neck, a touch so gentle, so full of a quiet, aching understanding that Sarah's throat tightened. It was a tenderness she hadn't seen from any man in a long, long time, and she was about to corrupt it. This brief hesitation was a flicker of weakness. She smothered it. "Mr. Cole," she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. Elias flinched as if struck. He spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to his hip before he remembered he wore no gun there. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide with surprise. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from a life of hard labor, but he held himself as if trying to take up less space in the world. He whipped his dusty hat from his head, crushing the brim in his hands. "Ma'am," he stammered, his gaze fixed somewhere on the ground between them. "Didn't hear you approach." "I need to speak with you," Sarah said, ignoring the apology. "When you're finished for the day, in the house." The silence that followed was heavy with his confusion. The house was her space, her late husband's space. In the 6 months he'd worked at Stony Ridge, he had never once set foot inside. It was a line no one crossed. Is something wrong with the stallion, Mrs. O'Connell?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "The stallion is fine," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Sundown. She turned and walked away without waiting for his answer, the rigid line of her back a fortress against the storm of his unspoken questions. Inside the house was a tomb of memories. The air was still thick with the scent of beeswax and the faint lingering aroma of her husband's cigar smoke. A portrait of him hung over the hearth, his painted eyes stern, his jaw set, a man who had carved this life from the wilderness. His eyes seemed to follow her, now judging her. "What are you doing, Sarah?" She poured a whiskey, the amber liquid afire in her empty stomach. She needed its courage. When a soft, hesitant knock came at the door precisely at sundown, her heart hammered against her ribs. "Come in." Elias entered, his large frame seeming to shrink in the doorway. He held his hat in both hands, a shield against the suffocating intimacy of the room. He was clean, his hair damp, but the scent of hay and honest sweat clung to him. He looked lost, a creature of the open range, trapped within 4 walls. "You wanted to see me, ma'am. Whiskey." She gestured with her glass. He shook his head quickly. No, thank you, ma'am. Sarah took a steadying breath the moment stretching into a taut, unbearable wire. She decided to cut it. There was no room for delicacy and desperation. I'm going to lose this ranch, Mr. Cole. His eyes finally met hers, filled with alarm. Mr. Kane. He has me dead to rights, she said, her voice flat. The will. It states that if I do not produce a male heir, Stony Ridge reverts to his control. I have a year. 9 months have already passed. Elias's face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Ma'am, I don't understand what this has to do with me. She walked closer, stopping just a few feet from him, forcing him to look at her. She let the silence hang, let him feel the weight of what was coming. I need a child, Elias, she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, and I cannot get one from a ghost. His face paled, the color draining away until his freckles stood out like flecks of rust. I need a man. A healthy, strong man. One who is unattached. I will pay you. Handsomely. Once I am with child and the doctor confirms it, you will be free to go. No one need ever know. She watched him, her gaze unwavering, her heart a cold, frantic bird in a cage. She had laid her soul bare, offering a devil's bargain in the house of her dead husband. Now all she could do was wait for the verdict from the shy, lonely cowboy whose world she had just shattered. She had laid her soul bare, offering a devil's bargain in the house of her dead husband. Now all she could do was wait for the verdict from the shy, lonely cowboy whose world she had just shattered. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It pressed in on them thick and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of Sarah's own heart. Elias stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin taut and pale over the hard lines of his jaw. He took a single stumbling step backward as if her words had been a physical blow. The hat in his hands was twisted into a mangled knot. He finally found his voice a raw, wounded whisper that was worse than any shout. Ma'am, do you think that I'm that kind of man? The question was not an accusation. It was a cry of profound hurt. For a moment, Sarah's cold resolve faltered. He wasn't a tool. He was a man with a man's pride. I think you're a good man, Mr. Cole, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. That is why I am asking you. I am not asking for a lover. This is a transaction, a business arrangement to save this land from a vulture who would see it burn. She gestured around the room at the heavy oak furniture, the polished floors, the legacy of a life's work. Everything you see will be gone. Jedediah Kane will plow it under and salt the earth. Is that what you want? He looked away from her, his gaze falling upon the stern portrait over the hearth. His throat worked, but no sound came out. The money. He finally managed, his voice thick with a shame that wasn't his. I don't want your money. Then why Sarah pressed a sliver of desperation creeping into her tone. Why would you stay here working for a ghost on a ranch that's doomed to die? He turned his haunted gaze back to her, and for the first time she saw past his shyness into the abyss of his loneliness. Because this land is quiet, he said, his voice barely audible. It doesn't ask questions. He took a ragged breath, and the story he had held, locked away for years, began to spill out a torrent of grief. I had a wife once, ma'am, back in Texas, and a little girl. Her name was Clara. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Fever took them both in the winter of '78. He continued, his eyes seeing a different room, a different time. 1 week. I buried them myself, on a patch of land that was supposed to be ours. A legacy. He spat the word like poison. There's nothing left of it now, or me. So you see, ma'am, what you're asking of me, it's not a transaction. It's a ghost. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different silence. It was filled with a shared, profound understanding of loss. Her cold, calculated plan suddenly felt cheap, obscene. She saw him now not as a solution, but as a man drowning in the same sea of grief as she was. "I'm sorry, Elias," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it was intimate, fragile. He flinched at the kindness unaccustomed to it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the proud, demanding ranch owner to the desperate, grieving widow beneath. He saw the trap she was in, a cage built by a dead man's pride and a live man's greed. A long minute passed. The fire popped, a spark flying onto the hearth. "If I do this," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision, "it's not for pay. It's for the land. For what it stands for a future that was stolen from him, for a legacy he could never have. He would be its steward, its ghost. And there are terms." Sarah nodded, her heart aching with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. "Name them." "No one ever knows," he said, his voice firm. "This is a secret we take to our graves. And it is only to be, as you said, an arrangement. Nothing more." "Nothing more," she agreed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He gave a single sharp nod, the bargain sealed. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped as if under an immense invisible weight. He paused at the door, his back still to her. "One more thing, ma'am." "Yes. Don't you ever look at me with pity," he said, his voice rough. "Not now. Not ever." Then he was gone, slipping out into the night, leaving the door open to the cold, dark air. The deal was made. A life for a life. But as Sarah stood alone in the haunted silence of her home, she couldn't escape the chilling certainty that in her desperate bid to create an heir, she had just made a bargain with a ghost. And she was terrified he would drag her down into the darkness with him. The deal was made. A life for a life. But as Sarah stood alone in the haunted silence of her home, she couldn't escape the chilling certainty that in her desperate bid to create an heir, she had just made a bargain with a ghost. And she was terrified he would drag her down into the darkness with him. The days that followed were taut with a silence that was louder than any argument. The vast open spaces of Stony Ridge suddenly felt claustrophobic, charged with the secret that pulsed between them. Sarah and Elias moved in separate orbits, two celestial bodies held apart by a force as powerful as gravity. She saw him from her porch, a distant, capable figure mending the things her world was made of: fences, harnesses, the broken heart of a water pump. He was the ranch's steady, silent heartbeat. He never looked her way. She felt his absence more than his presence. At meals, the empty chair opposite her was a gaping wound. At night, the house groaned with a profound emptiness that her husband's living presence had never quite filled, but which Elias's spectral bargain now amplified into a roar. Then the night came. A Tuesday. A night she had marked on her calendar with a single brutal X. Her bedroom was a sanctuary of grief, and she violated it with methodical precision. She stripped the quilt her mother had made, replacing it with a plain, cold sheet. She took her husband's photograph from the nightstand and placed it face down in a drawer. The room, once warm and familiar, was now as sterile and unwelcoming as a doctor's office. She waited, clad in a simple white nightgown, her body rigid, her soul braced for the transaction. His knock was so soft she almost missed it. He entered without a word, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the hallway. In the dim lamplight, his face was unreadable, carved from stone and sorrow. He did not look at her, but at the floor, at the walls, at anything but the woman waiting in the bed. What passed between them was not passion. It was a ritual of shared desperation, a quiet, mechanical act shrouded in a terrible, profound sadness. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, the touch of a man remembering a ghost. Her own body was a traitor responding to a human closeness it had been starved of, even as her mind screamed in protest. It was an act of two lonely souls colliding in the dark, seeking not pleasure, but a fragile, desperate kind of survival. a means to an end. When it was over, he dressed in the darkness and left without a word. Sarah lay awake until dawn, the sheets beside her cold, the silence he left behind 1,000 times heavier than before. The morning was brittle with unspoken things. He was already in the corral when she emerged, his back to the house, his movements stiff. The other ranch hands, simple, honest men, could feel the strange cold current that now flowed from the main house. They threw confused glances between their silent boss and their withdrawn foreman. The entire ranch was holding its breath. The tension finally snapped, not from within, but from without. A young hand named Billy came galloping into the yard. His horse lathered his face, pale with panic. "Mrs. O'Connell, it's the north fence, cut clean through. Looks like a whole bunch of yearlings were driven off into the canyons." Rage, pure and hot, surged through Sarah, a welcome fire after the chilling cold of the past few days. Jedediah Kane. It was his first real move. How many, she demanded, her voice cutting through the morning air. "Hard to say, ma'am. 30, maybe 40 head." A murmur of despair went through the other hands. 40 head was a devastating loss. A wound the ranch might not survive. "We'll never find 'em in those canyons," one of the older hands muttered. "They'll be scattered to kingdom come by now." Sarah felt a familiar wave of helplessness wash over her. She was a woman alone, her authority a fragile thing. But then a low voice cut through the defeatist chatter. "We will if we ride now." It was Elias. He stepped forward from the shadows of the barn, and for the first time in days he looked directly at Sarah. The shyness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hard, focused light. The ghost had been banished, and in his place stood a leader. "They'll drive him hard for a few hours, then slow to let him graze and hide the tracks," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced the other men. "The trail will be freshest now. Billy, you and Hank ride the west ridge. See if you can spot their dust. I'll take the main trail. We can corner them before they reach the deep passes." The men who had been looking at Sarah for orders now turned to Elias, nodding, their hope rekindled by his quiet confidence. He was no longer just a hired hand. He was the foreman. He was hope. "I'm going with you," Sarah said, the words leaving her mouth before she could think. "Ma'am, it's too dangerous," Billy protested. Elias's gaze held hers, a long, unreadable look passing between them. The secret of the night before was still there, a chasm between them, but now a new fragile bridge was being built across it. The bridge of a shared purpose. The bridge of a common enemy. He gave a single curt nod. "Saddle the mare." As she and Elias prepared to ride out side by side into the vast, unforgiving canyons, Sarah felt a dizzying shift in her world. They were no longer just a widow and her hired ghost. They were partners, hunters, and as they spurred their horses forward, leaving the relative safety of the ranch behind, Sarah knew with a terrifying certainty that the greatest danger she faced was not losing her cattle to Jedediah Kane, but losing her heart to the silent, broken man who now rode as her equal. As they spurred their horses forward, leaving the relative safety of the ranch behind, Sarah knew with a terrifying certainty that the greatest danger she faced was not losing her cattle to Jedediah Kane, but losing her heart to the silent, broken man who now rode as her equal. The canyons swallowed them whole. The world shrank to a narrow ribbon of sky overhead, and the towering, sun-scorched walls of red rock that rose on either side. It was a place of stark, brutal beauty, a landscape that promised nothing and cared for no one. Sarah was a capable horsewoman born and raised in this unforgiving country, but here she was a novice. Here, Elias was king. He was transformed. The quiet, withdrawn man who haunted the edges of her ranch was gone. In his place was a creature of the earth, his body moving in perfect sync with his horse, his eyes constantly scanning, reading a language she could not comprehend. He was not just looking. He was listening to the wind, to the stones, to the silence itself. He would raise a hand and they would stop. 3 riders, he said once, his voice a low murmur. He pointed to a patch of disturbed gravel she would have galloped over without a thought. Their horses are shod. They're pushing the herd hard. See how the prints are deep at the toe. He was a ghost tracking other ghosts. He saw the story in a broken sage branch, the timeline in the freshness of a pile of dung. Sarah rode behind him, a silent, humbled student. The awkwardness of their secret pact dissolved under the harsh sun, burned away by the intensity of the hunt. It was replaced by something else, something she was afraid to name. A deep, growing respect that felt dangerously close to awe. The trail led them upward onto a narrow, treacherous ledge overlooking a sheer drop. The wind howled through the pass, a mournful, hungry sound. Sarah's mare, spooked by the height, lost its footing. A collective gasp of stone and sliding shale. The horse shrieked, scrambling for purchase, and for one heart-stopping second, Sarah saw the world tilt into a dizzying abyss. She never had time to scream. In a blur of motion, Elias was beside her. His arm, hard as iron, shot out, grabbing her mare's bridle with a force that seemed impossible. He leaned his weight, his own horse groaning in protest, and hauled the panicked animal back from the brink. For a long moment, they were frozen there. His hand was just inches from her knee. His face was a mask of fierce, protective concentration. The scent of him, dust and sweat and leather, filled her senses. It was the first time he had touched her in a way that was not part of their cold, clinical bargain. This was instinct. This was protection. The moment stretched, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the danger they had just escaped. He released the bridle, his face immediately shuddering again. "We should rest the horses," he said, his voice rough. He turned away as if embarrassed by the instinct that had saved her life. They made a cold camp as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky. The fire was small, nearly smokeless, a tiny flicker of life in the immense, gathering dark. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not the awkward, tense silence of the ranch, but a quiet, companionable stillness. "How do you do it?" Sarah finally asked, her voice soft in the vast emptiness. "How do you see all that?" Elias stared into the flames, his profile etched against the flickering light. "My father taught me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He said the land always tells the truth. Men lie. The land, it can't." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. "He was a scout. Before me." A small piece of his past offered up like a rare, precious stone. It was a beginning, a fragile thread of connection in the wilderness. The desert night grew cold, and a chill that had nothing to do with fear settled deep into Sarah's bones. She shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Elias noticed. Without a word, he stood, took off his heavy sheepskin-lined duster, and walked over to her. He didn't hand it to her. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was a shock. The warmth of it was a revelation. It smelled of him, pine smoke horse, and the clean masculine scent of a man who lived under the open sky. She was enveloped in it, a gesture of pure, unthinking care that was more intimate than anything that had passed between them in her bedroom. She felt a profound, aching sense of being protected. It was a feeling she thought she had buried with her husband. She looked up to thank him, but the words died in her throat. He wasn't looking at her. His body was rigid, his gaze fixed on the impenetrable darkness further down the canyon. He raised a single commanding hand for silence. Sarah held her breath, listening. At first she heard nothing but the wind. Then she caught it. Faint, but unmistakable. The low murmur of men's voices carrying on the night air. And through a gap in the rocks, a tiny flickering point of orange light. A campfire. They had found them. Cain's men. And from the sound of it, they were not alone. A cold dread washed over her. They were trapped in the dark heart of the canyon, and the hunters had just become the hunted. They were trapped in the dark heart of the canyon, and the hunters had just become the hunted. The firelight danced across the canyon walls, painting the rocks in grotesque, writhing shapes. Sarah pressed herself flat against a cold slab of granite. The duster Elias had given her a small, fragile shield against the immense, terrifying dark. Down below, 4 men were silhouetted against the flames. 4, not the 2 she had expected. They were laughing, a rough, ugly sound that echoed in the sacred silence of the canyon. Her stolen cattle, the lifeblood of Stony Ridge, were penned in a makeshift corral of ropes and scrub brush, their soft, nervous lowing a mournful counterpoint to the men's mirth. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. This was a fool's errand. They were outmatched, outgunned. Beside her, Elias was unnervingly still. He was a part of the rock, a shadow among shadows. The panic that threatened to consume her was held at bay by his profound, unnerving calm. He was not a man afraid. He was a predator observing his prey, calculating. His eyes narrowed to slits, missed nothing, the lazy posture of the man on watch, the placement of their rifles, the narrow, rocky pass that led out from the far side of their camp. "We go back," Sarah whispered, her voice a dry crackle of sound. "We live to fight another day." "Cain won't give us another day," Elias murmured back, his voice so low it was more a vibration than a sound. "He'll have those yearlings over the county line by sunrise. We lose them tonight. We lose them forever." As he spoke, one of the figures by the fire turned, his face illuminated in the golden glow as he took a swig from a bottle. Sarah's blood ran cold. The face was bloated and familiar, with a drooping mustache and the lazy, arrogant eyes of a man who believed himself untouchable. It was Deputy Miller, the law from Harmony Creek. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Cain's rot ran deeper than she could have imagined. It had poisoned the very men sworn to protect people like her. There was no one to run to, no justice to be found. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The last flicker of hope in her died. "Then it's over," she breathed the words, tasting of ash. "No," Elias said. His hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering just above her arm, a gesture of fierce protective energy. "It's not over. We don't fight them. We take back what's ours." He began to whisper his plan, his words a thread of impossible strategy in the face of certain death. He would circle around a ghost in the darkness to the far side of the makeshift corral. She would create a diversion, a loud, sudden, terrifying noise from the opposite direction to draw their attention. In that moment of confusion, he would cut the ropes and stampede the cattle through the narrow pass. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was the only chance they had. "They'll kill you," she whispered, horrified. "They have to see me first." He replied, a grim confidence in his voice. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, the long, heavy weapon that had been his constant companion. He pushed it into her hands. "Can you use this?" The cold, heavy weight of the steel was foreign, deadly. "My husband taught me." "Good." He pointed to a high, unstable scree slope on the canyon wall directly opposite their position. "When I give the signal a hawk's cry 3 times, you fire into the base of those rocks. Not at the men. At the rocks. Make the mountain speak. That's your diversion." She stared at him, at the absolute, unwavering trust in his eyes. He was placing his life in her hands. The thought was both terrifying and electrifying. She, who had felt powerless for so long, was now the fulcrum upon which their survival turned. "I understand," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. He gave a single sharp nod. Then, without another word, he melted into the darkness. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that defied his size, a phantom against the stone. Sarah was left alone, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the heavy rifle resting on the rock before her. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The men below laughed and drank blissfully, unaware of the ghosts watching from the rocks. She watched the spot where Elias had disappeared, her entire being focused on the darkness, waiting. Waiting. Then it came. Kriya. The cry was so perfect, so natural, that for a moment Sarah thought it was a real hawk. The men by the fire barely glanced up. Kriya. A second cry, closer, more urgent. One of the men grunted, looking around nervously. Kriya. The third cry. The signal. It was time. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat, but her grip on the rifle was sure. She was no longer just a widow, no longer just a woman bound by a desperate contract. She was a hunter, a protector, a partner. She lined up the sights on the pale shifting rock, took a deep breath, and whispered a prayer to a god she was no longer sure she believed in. The future of Stony Ridge and the life of the only man she had left to trust rested on a single shot in the dark. She squeezed the trigger. She squeezed the trigger. The world exploded in a symphony of violence. The crack of the rifle was instantly devoured by a deeper guttural roar as the mountain groaned and gave way. A river of rock and dust thundered down the canyon wall, a man-made avalanche that shook the very ground. Below, the rustlers' camp dissolved into chaos. Men shouted in confusion and terror, their figures swallowed by a thick, choking cloud. Through the maelstrom, Sarah saw a phantom's movement. Elias. He was a blade in the darkness, his knife flashing as he severed the corral ropes. The terrified cattle trapped between the terrifying noise and a sudden open path surged as one. A wave of horns and hooves, a stampede of pure, panicked instinct. For a heart-stopping second, Elias was nearly lost in the surge, but he swung onto his horse with a fluid grace, his voice a sharp, commanding cry that cut through the din, turning the herd's terror into a focused, forward momentum. They poured through the narrow pass. The rustlers, finally realizing the trick, opened fire blindly into the dust. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the canyon walls with angry metallic shrieks. It was Sarah's turn to move. She scrambled down from her perch, her lungs burning, and threw herself onto her mare. She galloped after the herd, her heart a wild thing in her chest, the sound of gunshots echoing behind her. They rode like devils, were on their heels, the thunder of their stolen herd a drumbeat of freedom. But as they rounded a sharp bend, a lone rider broke from the rocks, cutting them off. Deputy Miller, his face a mask of snarling fury, his pistol leveled. "That's far enough, widow!" He spat, his eyes glittering with greed. "Cain pays better than your dead husband ever did." He aimed his gun not at Elias, but squarely at Sarah. Time seemed to slow the world, narrowing to the dark, hateful hole of the pistol's barrel. But Elias was faster. With a roar that was torn from the depths of his soul, he spurred his horse, crashing into Miller's mount with brutal force. The shot went wide, a flash of orange in the darkness. Men and horses screamed. In a tangle of leather and limbs, Elias unseated the deputy, and the two men crashed to the ground. Sarah watched in horrified awe as her quiet, gentle cowboy fought with a cold, savage efficiency. It was not a barroom brawl. It was an execution of will. He didn't kill Miller. He broke him, leaving him disarmed and gasping in the dust. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying mask of righteous fury. "Tell Cain," he growled, his voice a low, deadly promise. "You tell him to stay away from Stony Ridge. You stay away from her." Then he turned, grabbed the reins of his horse, and swung back into the saddle, leaving the broken man and his broken laws behind. The long ride home was a dream. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness, the weary, reclaimed herd a shuffling shadow around them. The adrenaline faded, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and a silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything that had passed between them. The shared fear, the absolute trust, the savage, desperate fight for a shared life. The sun was just beginning to touch the sky with fingers of pale gold as they crested the final hill and saw it. Home. Stony Ridge nestled in the valley, its windows dark, its fences standing waiting for them. As the other hands ran out, their shouts of disbelief and joy filling the morning air, Sarah and Elias were left for a moment in their own bubble of quiet. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady on her waist. The duster he had given her was still wrapped around her shoulders. She turned to face him, the rising sun catching the exhaustion and the wonder on her face. "Elias," she whispered, her voice thick. "You saved me. You saved everything." He looked down at her, the last of the shadows finally gone from his stormy eyes. "We saved it," he said softly. "Together. All the walls were gone, all the bargains, all the ghosts. There was only this man, this moment." She reached up her hand, trembling slightly, and cupped his rough, unshaven cheek. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, his own hand coming up to cover hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her own. He looked at her, truly seeing her, and then his gaze drifted downwards to her waist, to the life they had made in a desperate, loveless bargain. The child she carried was no longer a contract. It was not an heir for a dead man or a claim to a piece of land. It was a promise, their promise, and in the quiet morning light, surrounded by the home they had bled for a future they had seized from the jaws of despair, they both knew, without a single word needing to be spoken, that they were finally truly home.